Hi everybody, it's Julessa again, and this week's video is going to be about soldering. Soldering is one of those techniques you either really love or you really can't stand to do, but is necessary to make jewelry. So a lot of the times the soldering is something that is very elusive and can make you very frustrated if you can't get it to work the way you want it to. So we're going to talk about the things that you should do and the things that you probably should avoid in order to make your soldering successful. So let's get started. So the first rule is make sure that your joints are clean. If they're not clean, the solder will not flow, or it'll flow very inconsistently. So you want to make sure that the joint where you're placing your flux and your solder is very, very clean. There's two ways to do this. You can use a degrease, actually there's three ways to do this. You can use a degreasing soap to clean both of the pieces really well before you place your flux and solder. Or you can take a piece of sandpaper and rough up the surface of both of the areas that you're going to be soldering together. And that creates two things. One, it gives you a little bit of tooth so that the solder has a place to flow. And it also will clean the metal from the oils and the grease and things that come off your fingers. The third way is to pickle your piece. Even if you haven't done any soldering yet, you can pickle it and rinse it off, and that will help clean the metal and give you a surface that will let the solder flow correctly. The next thing is controlling your heat. If you don't control your heat, you're going to have two outcomes. One, the flame is going to be too hot and melt your two pieces. Or two, it's not going to be hot enough and the solder won't flow. The last thing you need to know is practice, practice, practice. This is something that does not come easily and it doesn't come overnight. It's going to take some time for you to learn how to control your heat, how to get in and get out fast, and to make sure that your solder joints are completely soldered. One of the ways I recommend practicing is to take different thicknesses and sizes of metal and try to solder them together. You can do several different ways. You can take a thick piece of metal and solder it to a thin piece of metal. You can take a large wire and solder it to a smaller wire. One of the things I like to do about wire soldering is to chamfer or miter my edges and try and get different angles in my soldering so that I can build things and construct things with a bunch of different ways to just solder wire together other than straight up butt joints. One of the other things you can do is practice doing your pick soldering, because pick soldering is generally the cleanest you can do. It doesn't require a lot of solder and it allows you to get that fine motion control in your hands in order to do the soldering and be steady with it. And don't worry if your hand shakes. Eventually, over time, it'll stop shaking. I know this. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's still on different days. The soldering fairies aren't very nice to me, and I've melted things still, and I still overheat the joints and underheat the joints. It just all depends on your frame of mind. So when you're first starting for the day, take a deep breath, give yourself some time to get in the mindset to go ahead and solder. And then do some practice runs first before you actually solder on your piece. That way you know whether or not the solder fairies are going to be kind to you. If they aren't very kind, maybe you should wait a little bit later in the day. If they are being kind to you, take advantage of it, because I'm telling you, they can be pretty stingy with their time. So I'm going to show you a few examples of the different ways you can practice, and hopefully they'll help you understand what I mean by butt joints and sweat soldering and pick soldering. So let's go ahead and get to the bench and try out these techniques. So the first thing we're going to talk about is cleaning your metal. I mentioned before that you want to pickle all your work before you start to use it as one way of cleaning the metal and making sure that it's ready for soldering. You can see here on copper, once it's been pickled, it's got this pink sheen to it. It's kind of a matte finish, and it will basically signify that your metal is clean. So when you place the flux on it, it won't pull up. And it doesn't matter if you're using a paste solder or a liquid solder, it's very important for you to clean the metal. On silver, you get this nice little white matte finish, and it will also do the same thing. And what it is the silver, the fine silver coming up from the inside of the metal to the top layer, and it has removed all of the copper oxides from it. This particular piece has a little bit of fire burn here, and that's because it was an ingot that I poured that was strictly from scrap. And when you're making ingots, the general rule of thumb is to use 50% brand new material and 50% scrap material, and I didn't do that with this piece. You can also see here on the brass, we've got a matte finish in the brass color, and then also this matte finish of copper, because brass has copper in it. So this is a piece that is clean and will be ready for soldering. The next thing we're going to talk about is practice. Practice is something that you have to do in order to get better at soldering, and I recommend practicing several different things. First, I would recommend practicing a sweat solder, and that's where you place the solder and melt it on one of the pieces, pickle it, and then place it on top of the other piece that you're planning to solder it to, fluxing it of course, and then heating both pieces simultaneously until they come up to temperature in order to make the solder flow. One thing to note about solder is that you also want your solder to be clean. So if you're using wire solder, I recommend taking a piece of sandpaper and running it along the solder wire before you use it. If you cut wire like I do, I sandpaper it and then I cut it into the little pieces, and I don't cut more than I think I'm gonna need, because if it sits out, it's gonna be dirty and it's really hard to clean the already cut pieces. The next way you can practice is to take a larger wire and solder it to a smaller wire. So this is about, I wanna say a 10 gauge copper wire, and this is an 18 gauge brass wire. There's two things that you can learn by doing two different metals and soldering butt to butt like this. First, you learn how to control your heat on the two different sized wires, and second, you're soldering two different types of metals together, so you can create pieces like copper to silver, silver to brass, brass to copper, and so on. The other thing you want to practice is your joints. You want to practice cleaning them up and getting them to sit side by side like this and solder them butt to butt. That's a horizontal, meaning this way, horizontal solder. Or you can also try a vertical solder and do it butt to butt this way, and that will help you learn how to, number one, control your heat and give you the skills to be able to create a three-dimensional piece. So the next thing I mentioned too was about doing pick soldering, and this is one of the best ways to practice your hand-eye coordination and also to practice using your torch. I use my pick in my dominant hand because I'm right-handed, and you should probably learn to do that as well, because you're going to need more of the fine motor skills to place your solder in the places that you want it to go. And then I use my torch in my left hand. And the reason I do this is because I want my left hand to be just about as strong and fine controlled as my right hand. So I use my torch in my left hand to control my heat, and then I use my pick to pick up my solder and place it onto the piece. And the way I do that for pick soldering is you heat up the piece of solder, you pick it up with your pick, and then place it onto the joint where you want it to solder. I'm planning on doing a more in-depth video about this technique, so stay tuned for that. The next thing I recommend doing is learning how to wire solder. And with wire solder, since you're holding your torch in your left hand, you can get that fine motor control on your solder in your right hand. And what I do is I hold the solder with my tweezers so that I don't burn my fingers, and heat the piece up until it's almost ready to solder, and then I touch down with my solder wire and let the solder flow in that direction. This is a much more difficult technique, and it's generally used on very large pieces like soldering spiculums or soldering a cup closed, or something that's a lot larger than a regular piece of jewelry, although you will see a lot of jewelers that prefer the wire soldering to the pick soldering. And last but not least, if you have paste, that's probably the simplest way, or solder paste, I should say. If you have solder paste, that's one of the most simplest way to solder, because you squirt the paste right on the joint and heat it up. And that paste is actually filled with flux and solder, so you've got two operations in one. So if you do use a paste solder, still make sure that your piece is clean. Squirt a little bit of the solder onto the joint and then heat until it flows. Last and certainly not the least, make sure you give yourself time. Time is going to be of the essence when you're practicing. If you don't practice using different types of base metals like copper and silver and brass, you're going to have a hard time working your way up to gold. And gold is what they call the simpler metal. It's easier to solder because there's different properties. But if you can learn to do silver, brass, and copper, you've got it made moving up to the other metals like gold and platinum. Not platinum. Platinum takes a whole nother, I don't even do platinum. Anyway, hopefully this video was helpful for you, and if so, give me a like down below, and if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below the video. I'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to like and subscribe the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.